Hello and welcome to episode 7.
It's either going to a blooper reel or you're going to keep it in the show, right?
There was so much planning that went into this.
I know.
We're just tripping over each other.
I want that needs.
Al needs to take those shades off. That's what needs to happen.
Okay, Nick, go. Take it away.
Welcome to episode 7 of Top Compliance Tips. Welcome to episode 7 of SCI Fridays, which today is Top Compliance Tips with Rufaro Warinda. And what we wanted to talk about is compliance. It sounds like everyone has to be compliant to something, but where do you even begin? And before we get into the serious part of the show, I want to address a complaint that we had, which was, Al, it was about you. And one of the complaints that we had, besides the fact that my office is too white, which I'm working on, is also that you weren't serious enough in the last episode.
Serious in the episode, parts of the episode, or like the entire 25 minutes I was not serious enough?
I think it was the beginning of the episode. So I think you've addressed that nicely with how you've chosen to appear.
On this
I thought you were going to be a boy band for a second.
Jeepers. It's not getting any better here.
Welcome, Rufaro.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. And I've been waiting a really long time to be able to do this. So I've got a question for the two of you, and you can keep it stored somewhere in the back of your heads, and then you can throw it and then pop an answer at the end of the show. We do have, modestly speaking, a couple of decades worth of experience on this call. And I wanted to ask, when it comes to compliance and governance, this is a personal thing to you. What's more important to you? Is it the technology or is it the principle? And on that note, Nick, you can roll the jingle.
I was going to say something stupid about Nick dancing in the background, but I'm not going to anymore. And this is where I have to get serious. Welcome to SCI Fridays, your portal into security, compliance, identity management, and you. If you're new to the channel, we talk about all things. Well, not all things. Well, we talk about things that get us excited, scared, dismayed, but mostly excited about cloud security, compliance, because we have Mr. Compliance on this week's show, and governance. So pull up a chair, grab that whiskey. That last plane has flown over the mountain in Cape Town. Grab a beer. I don't know what you want to drink, or a really strong coffee, depending on where you are in the world. And hang out with us for the next 15 to 20 minutes, because we don't know how long Rufaro is actually going to talk to us today about. Talk to us today. I don't know how to finish that sentence. I didn't graduate well in English, so I never know how to end a sentence. I can start a sentence, but I struggle with ending a sentence.
And you can carry on in the sentence for such a long time, but finishing is sometimes a problem. I agree with you.
Yes, I think that's the missing link in my personality makeup, right? The genetic makeup of my personality is that I don't end well. Although I did end well on Tuesday morning's run, when next week's guest, who didn't show up. Let me just put it out there. She did not show up for the run, but I ended well with Nick. Okay. What happens now, Nick? Do we go to the next segment in the show? You stop. People can see you looking at your phone, Nick. At least I've got glasses on, so if I'm looking at the other screen, they can't see me, right?
Actually, I was looking at my air conditioner remote because it's hot. It's currently summer in South Africa. And if you're unfortunate to live in the northern hemisphere where it's cold, I'm really sorry for you. And with that, let's just move over to our Satya statement. Alistair?
It's a Satya quote from his Hit Refresh book, and we love referencing Satya on the show. Last week, it was about culture eats something for breakfast. I can't remember. This week, it's every person, organization, and every society reaches a point at where they owe it to themselves to hit refresh, to re-energize, renew, reframe, and rethink their purpose. And today's purpose is really around how do you become compliant with your technology stack? With guest on the show, Rufaro from the place where those Black Panther people are from, because it's almost like his middle name. I can't remember his middle name, right? He doesn't
That's
put it
not
in
compliant. You can't say that on the show.
Definitely not. My middle name is Cletus, and Cletus is in the Bible, and
Yes,
I think
was
it appears in Greek mythology
Maximus
as well.
Aurelius, that guy, right? And you just, and then Warinda to end it off with, right? So welcome to the show, Rufaro. Just a little bit about who you are, how old you are, and what you do weekends, and why did we ask you to come on the show today?
All right. Firstly, thanks for having me, gents. It's a great place to be. I'm always in the background. I've always been a huge fan. It's good to be here. So really, just to put it simply, where I sort of fit into the mold and scheme of things is predominantly on the governance side, and that's predominantly now governance, and we're talking compliance. As we've seen now with the way technology has transformed the way businesses operate, standards and legislation and all these requirements have required business to operate in a certain way. And this best practice has now had to take on a different, put on a different hat rather, simply because of the fact that the technology that we're using now has to have the same level of compliance. Now, because we're not living in a world where you have file cabinets that are just stored in a room somewhere, the way that you manage your business remotely online, the big question is, and this is where I sort of step in, is how do you maintain that level of compliance, and how do you maintain that standard of governance in modern work or in the modern workspace or with the new technology stack, and how do you keep up with that as that expands? So where I come in is on the forefront of most implementations is building you a governance framework that's tailored to you and your technology stack and whatever tech or whatever systems you really do use, whatever system you prefer to use, and making sure that you maintain that standard of compliance throughout. And also just the recognition that compliance is never a sort of endpoint, it's continuous, and just sort of enabling you to continue on that journey as you expand and grow your business.
While I love that, you've also, sorry, Al, you've also just answered two of the questions that I had for you a little bit later on. So it's like overachieving much?
Sorry.
Rufaro, just to dispel the rumors that's going around in the industry about you. Someone told me about 6 months ago that you actually built a compliance manager that Nick's going to talk about now. You've actually built a compliance manager in an Excel spreadsheet. And then you got introduced 4 years after working on that to compliance manager inside of the compliance center, and that ruined your purpose. Is this true?
Yeah, it looks like that little birdie is telling the truth. It's still something very triggering for me to speak about, but yes, it was it was trying to convince myself that, all those years of work weren't completely nullified. But just to summarize it was the process of mapping various governance frameworks from legislation all across the board, mapping the similarities against each other, so that businesses were able to implement the optimum solution or the optimum control or the optimum framework in certain instances, however you want to put it, so that in whichever framework you're audited against, whichever legislation you looked against, that you are compliant across the board. Because that was a big issue with industry. They were complaining about the number of audits that they had to go through, and it would be amazing to have one framework that you can comply to, and sort of mapping across the same action and be compliant to multiple controls. Now, what Microsoft did is they built up a huge framework of about 3,084 controls. They might be more now since the updates.
Is that come about
just about 3,084? Listen, I'm not going to talk about my obsessions now. And what they did is they basically did the same thing. In essence, when new assessments and new frameworks were coming in, be it NIST, Corbett, ITIL, what have you, those controls were then divided into subdivisions of whatever parts of those standards, and those implementation sort of tick box exercises would have you theoretically compliant to those standards and those guidelines and those legislations.
Nick, do you want to bring up compliance manager, and then Rufaro can just talk us through while we're here, right?
Sweet. So if you could just, minimize this screen, I can talk through this
from that.
a little bit.
I want to point out very quickly, though, that we are in compliance.microsoft.com. And I just want to point out that we do have two South African templates, which is the South African Consumer Protection Act and the South African Electronic Communications and Transactions Act. And something that stopped customers traditionally in engaging in tools like this is the lack of local relevance. And this means that we don't just look at things like the POPIA Act, which is also represented, as well as NIST and CIS. So these are some of the more traditional offerings that we would look at in terms of compliance manager templates.
So Rufaro, talk to us about customers that are spending time in the Office 365 space. I mean, we've asked what is compliant, what is compliance, right? There's a legislative or regulative standard that organizations based on the industry vertical that they are in need to subscribe to, so that in order to show up, they can actually be compliant. And in the old days, you had a filing cabinet that made you compliant, and certain health and safety regulations, like in mines, where you put a little rubber thing behind the wheel so that the car can roll back. Those sort of things made them compliant, and they could operate as a mine or as a bank. And that's why you need to be compliant. Naturally, moving to the cloud, that has changed things, right? So why do you care about compliance? Because you can get fined. The next thing for me is, once a customer's moved to Office 365, because most customers you're dealing with are already there, what is it that they need to do, right, in order to become compliant? I mean, we talked about what these tools look like and where they want to go with it. Just explain to us what we're looking at, because customers look at this and they have no clue. You've spent years spending time talking through this and helping customers with this. So how do you help customers become compliant with the tooling that is available to you today?
100%. Thanks for that question, Al. So the first thing that I am going to sort of state is, I think context is very important for any organization. And I think the important thing to do is to really look at what your governing processes as an organization are, what your policies look like, what your procedures look like, and make sure that you're not necessarily going to now move away from that because you've migrated or you're utilizing Office 365 and it's this wild and this beautiful environment that, that sort of has everything there for you. What's important to remember is that any standard and any sort of legislative requirement will never tell you step by step exactly what to do in order to be compliant. There's always a variance in terms of how you can go about the implementation to make sure that you are compliant. I think that's the key thing, and that's the most important thing here, because when you open this up, it can be very, very overwhelming to sort of look at these hundreds and hundreds of frameworks that are there, and if the requirement isn't there for you to be compliant to them already, if you aren't compliant to them already, it is quite overwhelming to take on. So I think the important thing is to context and implement these frameworks within the context of your business. As you'll see, as you work through these, you'll see that Microsoft gives recommendations as to how you can go about this and different methods of doing it. And at the end of the day, it's all up to the business really to make sure that it's as close to the way that you operate on a day-to-day as possible.
Rufaro, I remember you talking about there's technology compliance, and then there's process compliance, and there's document compliance. You broke that up quite nicely. Can you just cover that? Because we now know we have a tool and we have some sort of controls and guidelines on what to do or something to do. We don't know what it is or how it would apply to our business, but if we were wanting to be ISO standard compliant or NIST compliant, you mentioned the things. There was a couple of things that you mentioned the last time I spoke to you.
Yeah. So thanks for that. So Nick, if you could open up Compliance Manager again, and then you can go into improvement actions. Right. So the way that these sort of improvement actions, they go by many names in this space, like improvement actions, control objectives, requirements, sections, whatever you'd like to call them really. and how Microsoft has chosen to sort of partition these in terms of what the requirements, what the featuring is. If you scroll to the right, I think it should pull up. We just want to filter them. I want to see if that filtering is there. Categories, I think it's categories. If you just click on the drop down for categories, and that's separated into, right? Yeah. So that's separated into various categories across the data protection baseline. Now, just to give a quick explanation on what the data protection baseline is, and that's Microsoft's framework. That's the holistic guide of absolutely every control that's available.
The one that ruined your life.
Yes, the one that ruined my life.
Yeah. And your purpose.
Within that, how that's partitioned and how that's separated is that with the improvement actions and the actions that you actually carry out, some of them are technical based, some are policy based, some are process based, and some are document based, right? So I'll give an example of a technical requirement. To do with user access management, implement MFA. Now, that technical requirement can satisfy a number of different requirements across a number of different frameworks, and that's what Microsoft has actually done. So if you implement your MFA, what you'll see on your compliance scores, you'll actually gain points, or you'll gain a percentage on a number of different frameworks across the board, because whether you're looking at NIST or you're looking at ISO 27000, 27001, there is a requirement somewhere in there for user access management, and that's where the sort of leveling and matching about comes about, right? The ones that are process driven, those are requirements, or those are suggestions rather, of how organizations can meet certain requirements built into the process. So it may not be something that's necessarily to do with the technology. Technology, you can leverage the technology, but the requirement on the standard is process-based. So Microsoft will give you a prescriptive requirements and say, go about doing A, B, C, D. For example,
so if I could introduce an analogy, it's like feeding your dog, right? You have a little dog, yay big, right? And you've got to feed the dog, right? They tell you to feed the dog, and if you feed the dog at 5 o'clock, it's compliant. They don't tell you where you need to feed the dog or what you need to feed the dog, right? The instruction is to feed the dog. So what you were mentioning earlier on, it's usually interpretive based on the industry vertical that you're in, and coming back to MFA, how do you implement MFA, right? So what is the transitional management process required in order to implement the technology? So Rufaro, last question before we go to the break. Can I say that? Where do companies start, right? Because you mentioned that it's a gargantuan task, right?
Yeah.
In order to become compliant, and the auditing firm still expected to show backup tape because they don't understand what cloud backup is, right? So where do customers start taking on this behemoth, this beast of tooling in order to start somewhere? Where do they start? Because it's very overwhelming.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think the first place to start are your internal company policies, procedures, what the rules that you go by. If there is a framework or a standard that you adopted that you have been working with for years, start there and then build and branch out. And I think the second and most important thing is having a risk-based approach to whatever implementation you're going to then go into. Because what you do find is that a lot of the overwhelming space that the compliance manager is, a lot of waffle can come in very quickly, and companies and clients can make the mistake of going out and purchasing all these different solutions that essentially don't serve the greater purpose of what it is. So the question I asked you in the beginning about what's most important to you, whether it's the principle, the technology, to me it's the principle, because the technology is the chess piece that you use to leverage to get to where you want to be in terms of the principle. So having a risk-based approach shows you as an organization what's applicable to me and where does my sort of golden chest sit. You know, things are going to be different across the board, whether you work in mining, whether you work in supply chain, whether you work in the finance industry with PCI, it varies across the board. And once you get an idea of where your value sits, or where your most valuable assets sit, then you'll know what governance to use and what the best practices would be to make sure that we have a secure environment.
So to wrap up your top compliance tips is, one, understand that compliance is a thing, right? You can't run away from it, right? This is not a wedding planner or that movie with I forget her name, where she runs away from all her weddings and she never gets married, and then eventually she gets married. Compliance is not a thing you put in the cupboard, right? And you close the door and it stays there, like governance documentation of yesteryear, where you could write a governance doc and they put it in that same filing cabinet that they used to work with. Compliance is real, it's here, and you can become compliant. That's the first thing. Second thing, start small, start with what you know, and then move into what you don't know, and make sure that you are able to do that. Oh,
Bless you.
you see, that's what happens when I talk about compliance. I struggle with anaphylactic shock, right? My throat wants to close up. I can't talk enough about compliance because it's all PTSD, right? And the last thing is understand what the tooling actually does. Have a look at the education stuff around how you can become compliant, and also risk mitigation on where you're going. Take on the risk, understand what the risk is if you don't do it, because that's risk management 101, right? Yeah. Does that wrap it up? Did I do a good job, Rufaro?
2 more things we want to add.
Sure.
We don't have enough. There's not enough time in the show, Nick.
One is that it never ends. So once you are compliant, you have to stay compliant. And the other one is that what you're thinking of is Julia Roberts from Runaway Bride. And with that, we move over to buzzword bingo. And
Nick, we missed it. We missed a segment, right? The in the news one.
Except that we went straight over to the Microsoft Compliance Portal, which was in the news.
Well, there is this week's top news that dropped this week outside of Microsoft buying Activision Blizzard, right? The cybersecurity reference architecture has dropped, right? So if you Google Microsoft cybersecurity reference architecture, that actually dropped on the 13th. And Rufaro, when I sent him the link, got very excited by it, right? You can already see he's sort of drooling out of the side of his mouth.
And you'll include the link in the show notes.
When of course I will, like I did last week, which you didn't do, even though you committed to doing.
It's because you are my conscience, Al.
Okay, let's moving on. Buzzword bingo.
Buzzword bingo.
Buzzword bingo. So,
and today,
do you want to pick one? We've got two.
No,
would you like to pick one?
We should do both because they're both amazing. They're both their own amazing.
Have you played bingo, Nick? Where they
all right?
roll the wheel?
Rufaro gets to choose one. Does Rufaro know what the options are?
No, he doesn't. No. So we're going to choose one for him. NIST. What does NIST mean? I mean, people talk about being NIST compliant, or they're CIS compliant, or they're using a CIS benchmark to become compliant. Nick, you've spent a lot of time in CIS, and I love CIS. I'm sure Rufaro did some NIST stuff. So what is NIST? Well, should we ask Rufaro? Is he going to tell us, or should we just read the show notes?
Well, when he stops clicking, because he's a very loud clicker.
He's a loud clicker. He was Googling.
So I can give a... Do I just give a... No, I actually wanted to pull something up here and actually share a nice little did you know fact for everybody that's sitting here. Just to add a bit more zhuzh to it. So from that 4-year framework that I spent my entire life's work being stolen by Microsoft from, so just to touch on NIST, really. NIST is a cybersecurity framework, like many others that are there, and it's built off of the precedents of detect, identify, protect, recover, and I think that one's just respond. And that is sort of a prescriptive top level, and there are implementation phases that sit below those. And we would be 80 years old if we went through each of them. But yeah, that's basically what NIST is. And where it ties into what I'm talking about, what I'm going to mention now, is ISO. I specialized in ISO 27001. And within that standard, that is information security. And a really cool fact is that for all the operational controls that ISO 27001, 73% of those are actually like mapped over and not necessarily, or not totally like for like, but are really, really close to what NIST provides. So if you're looking to comply to one or the other, those two speak really, really well to each other. So that's just a nice little did you know fact. Cool.
Did you like the fact that we added more zhoosh to this show? And that's a wrap, people. Is it a wrap, Nick? Is this when we end? Because we added.
If you like the show, don't forget.
Oh, yes. If you like the show, please hit the like, link, and subscribe button. And when we eventually get to YouTube, if you need to find Rufaro on the interwebs, he's at Faro_RCW. We don't know. Oh, is that your initials? RCW.
Yeah, those are my initials.
All right. I am at Alistair Pugin, and Nick
at Nicolas Blank.
Yeah, Nick likes to be brought to shows where you can hold babies and like the Pope. He
doesn't make me sound creepy at all.
No, funny enough, I was talking.
The only place that's appropriate is if he was like the president of the United States of America.
Well, that's what he wants: take selfies, kiss babies, those sort of things. Anyhow, thank you very much for this is episode 7, right? For sticking around for episode 7 of SCI Fridays with our special guest, Rufaro Warinda. I can't do, let's get ready to, I've done that already. Thanks, Rufaro, for spending time with us. If you have any questions, remember there is a live section every week. There's a comment section that we reply to. We will make sure all the guests are listed there so you can ping them directly if you have any questions. And stick around and we'll be back next Friday. Ciao, ciao.